Hello everyone, and as he said, my name is Carlos Casals, and I'm going to be talking to you about environment creation using a modular approach. But first things first, who am I? My career into art has been quite a bit of a tricky one. I was working as an artist. I actually started in finance. I was working as a financial auditor for a few years, when I realized this really deep thought that making video games is slightly more fun for me. So then I decided to do the switch into becoming an environment artist. I worked in a few small indie projects, and for the last 2 years, I've been working in Undead Clash as the main environment artist. Now, what I want to talk about you today is the benefits of using modules when you're creating environments, and I want to walk you through the process that I use to implement this into our scenes in Undead Clash. Now, a bit of an overview of the process that we're going to use when we're creating an environment is first coming from the design team. The design team will come and they will say, okay, we are going to make a zombie game, and we need a big blank area for the zombies to roam around, to move around, so the player can shoot them. And we want this to be, for example, a spaceship or an abandoned hospital. Once we get that, the concept artist enters the scene. The concept artist will grab the theme that design has set for us, and he will create a mood concept. And after that, I will get the concept art and the needs from design, from design, and I will create a scene in 3D. So, the first process, the first part is gray boxing. Now, what I'm going to describe to you today is an ideal world. So, in an ideal world, design will provide us with a very simple level formed mainly of gray, simple boxes. These boxes are not supposed to be pretty. They are only supposed to represent space and volumes. And this is the very important part. It should only be given to us when it's been approved by design. However, anyone who has worked in production will know that things don't really work that nicely all of the time. And more often than not, there's always a last-minute suddenly other 5 roads. Okay. Hello. Yeah. So there's always some changes that delay the whole process. But then the next stage, the concept art. When we're working in our current game, we used mood concept. So what is the point of a mood concept? The point of a mood concept for us is to recreate the scene. However, it's not supposed to be a one-by-one scenario. The mood concept is something that the concept artist does for us as sort of a vibe feel of what the scene should look like. We are not going to try to replicate it perfectly. However, we will take it into account. And the best example, I'm going to ask you to try to memorize a bit this concept art that we got. And here on our next slide, we got the 3D level that we did based on this mood concept. As you can see, there's been a few changes. The road had to be bigger because design decided that they needed 5 more meters for zombies. We added a tank, we removed some cars. But the general vibe of the scene, the general feeling that it gets, it's quite similar to the one that we delivered in the mood concept. And now, to the main part of the presentation, building modular systems. When you're working in production, you have quite a tight time frame to work with. That means that even though I would absolutely love to do every asset individually and spend much time and love doing everything as good as I can, in reality, we are going to have to think and plan, how can I create a good environment, a fun environment, in a feasible amount of time? And that's where modular systems kick in. So, what is a modular system? Well, looking at the previous example, let's suppose that you've been tasked with, for example, generating a city. A city scene might, for example, have, I don't know, 20 buildings, something like that. You are most definitely not going to spend half a year modeling 20 different buildings, all of them with slight variations, all of them textured by hand. That would be completely unreasonable. So what we're going to do is we are going to create different modules that we will later combine together to generate the buildings. For example, in this example here, you see I've got a bunch of doors and windows. And the key and most important thing that you need to take away from this is that I made sure that all of these modules are exactly 3 meters wide. Why do I do this? I do this because here I don't have 5 windows. Now that I made sure that they are all the same exact dimensions, I can mix and match into countless possible combinations. So now, in the next slide, for example, you see an example of the same modules that we saw before, combined into a few of the many buildings that we could generate with them, but I could only fit 4 of them into the slide. Once we have the modules tested and we know that they work together, we can combine them into creating something. So in this scene, for example, this is a dragon dungeon. And as you can see, there's quite a few different angles. There's a little throne for the king. We've got a little of a dragon skull. And these are all the assets that we've used to generate that scene. And this is the key part. This whole scene has been done with less than 17 assets. And that is the power of modularity. It means that with very few, but very well thought out assets, you can actually create entire environments that then the player can do. And that allows you to spend time with more environments, more details, or whatever your art lead wants you to do. Now, hero assets. I've talked a bit about the buildings. I've talked about the little environment with the dragon skull. However, not everything can be a modular system. Not everything can be a repeated window or a repeated wall. Sometimes scenes have very key important assets that will be the center of attention. These assets are called hero assets. And they are more often than not the main focus of the scene. Now, this can be for a variety of reasons. Maybe they are key for the plot of the game. Maybe the player will interact with them in any way. Or they have a lot of weight in storytelling. Either way, we know and we're going to guide the player in the scene to focus into these hero assets. Now, because of this, when we're working in undead class hero assets, we allow ourselves to spend more time in them than we would when, for example, doing a barrel or a plank of wood. Why? Because we know the player doesn't really care if there's 7 or 12 or 100 variations of a rusted barrel. He's just not going to notice. However, what the player does care about is if the train wreck looks cool. Now, because of this is an example. In one of the levels that we were working on, we had to create this abandoned metro station. We decided that for this scene, it was very important for the storytelling to make sure that the player understood that there had been violence, so we had to add a bit of blood. It had been abandoned. Survivors had walked in the past into here. So we decided to actually spend quite a bit of time and resources into creating this specific asset because we knew the importance it had to the scene. Hero assets and modular assets worked combined. They are both integral parts on our scene creation. When we're designing a scene from the beginning, we plan not only which assets we're going to be able to repeat and be modular, but which assets are going to be the main focus of attention. And, okay, so we had the concept from the concept artist. We created some modules and we modeled some hero assets. What comes next? Well, we texture them. Now, texturing, there's 3 main modules, ways we work in Undead Clash. The first one is the run-of-the-mill standard texturing. I think all of us are pretty familiar with it, but if not, when you generate an asset, you get some UVs and you texture them. Then there is some tileable textures, which are when you get a repeated pattern, like let's say bricks, and you repeat it infinitely through the assets. This works for walls, for large structures. And then the third method, tileable textures combined with vertex painting. And I'm going to go a bit into depth for all of them. So standard texturing, as I said, many assets will just be very unique. You can't always repeat an asset. Maybe you're doing, for example, the crashed helicopter I mentioned earlier. Because of this, you're going to need to texture this asset by hand. There's no point using a generic drop material. You have to actually sit down and put some details, write the number, maybe paint some grunge, maybe splatter some blood. And because of this, this does take some time, but it can really be worth it because in this specific example, the UVs that you're seeing now were for one of our hero assets for a stadium scene. And this would be the end result of the standard texturing. We decided that this asset was very important for the storytelling, so we actually individually textured it. However, this is not possible to do always, and here we go back to our building modules. If you look at the screen, I don't know if you can see it very clearly, but all of the red ones are tileable bricks. So what we have done here is all of the UVs are done to be the exact same size. Because of this, it allows us to just get one very simple brick texture, drop it to the whole scene, and with that simple texture, we cover all the assets. However, players are not stupid. And if you see the exact same pattern of brick repeating over and over and over and over again, they're going to be like, well, this is quite low quality, or maybe break the immersion they have in the scene. So it's extremely important that whilst I really recommend you use tileable textures, you need to break it up. You have to make sure that the player maybe not hide it completely, because you can't possibly stop bricks from being bricks. But you have to really put effort into breaking the pattern. What we have done in this example is that whilst we do have all the bricks lying around, we have all these blue and pink and green materials. These are materials that later on we will manually texture. So when we combine it with the bricks, it will break up the scene. It will break up the repetition of the pattern. And now, vertex painting. Vertex painting is a very powerful tool, and I don't want to go too into depth of how it works. I just want to make you all very aware of its benefits. The way vertex painting works is it allows you to get a tileable material, a tileable texture, and paint it on top of another one. So in this example, let's assume we have 5 planes with bricks, and all of them are a tileable texture, so it looks the exact same. However, I can grab vertex paint and paint on top a different kind of brick, something that's a bit more broken, and then it breaks the pattern. And an example of this would be in this slide. In here, what you're seeing is a very simple plane with one tileable material for bricks that has been painted over with a same material for bricks, just more worn down. When you do stuff like this in the scene, you can do it in any shape you want, the amount you want. It allows you to make each building, even though it's the exact same 2 textures. But if you combine it in different ways, you can have countless different, completely different assets that the player would not really notice. And now, I talked about how I model my assets, I talked about how we plan the scene, and I talked about how we texture them. But once we have all of this, how do we actually build the scene? In the example that you're going to see right now, it's important to note the lighting is already done. This is not how we would actually do it, but I took some images from a finished scene. So don't think that the lighting would be done. But this example right here. In this example right here for the metro, we created a very simple modular system for all the columns and all the walls on the sides. It's very simple. It's very basic geometry shapes. It's cubes, boxes, nothing fancy. And we set it in the scene. Now, once we do this, the next step of what we do is we created a different set of modular assets of pipes and tubes. And if you look at the roof, we combined it together. So we start from the biggest asset that we have, which is the walls, the buildings, the architecture, and then we add other assets, other modular assets, in this case the pipes, and we combine them together to already make the scene look more interesting. However, this is still not good enough. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add the hero asset. If you look right at the red tunnel and right next to the camera, you will see now that the train that I showed you earlier, the hero asset, has been added to the scene. And I want to go back a bit about why it's a hero asset. Well, in our zombie shooter gallery game, this train is going to be right next to the camera and right in front of the camera. We decided not only it tells a story, but it's actually quite close to the player, and the player is going to feel it. So this goes back to what I said about composition. The hero assets are the center of the scene. We work around the hero assets. But this is not enough. We still have to make something to make the scene feel alive. This feels empty. So if you look at the sides and the corners where the people usually would wait for the train before the apocalypse, we now add the small assets. Now these small assets are what I say, the barrel and the planks. It's very simple stuff. None of these assets by itself would be quite impressive. However, in combination with everything else, it really helps tell a story. It really helps build up a scene. And at the end, a good environment has storytelling. That's the key of a great environment. And finally, we've got everything. We just need the final small details. And we have created the entire scene. So I just want to walk through the process fast so you see the changes. And this is how we work in Undead Clash, from bigger to smaller. Oh, sorry, this is falling all the time. Okay, so lightning. Now, lightning is an art form by itself, and I could do a whole presentation on why lightning is important and different methods of lightning. I really want to stress out two very important points. The first one is no matter how good your scene is, no matter how much you put effort into the assets, into the textures, how beautiful you are at modeling things, if the lightning doesn't work, your work will not work. Lightning makes or breaks a scene. A good scene with bad lightning will be a bad scene. And the second point I want to focus is because we're working in an apocalyptic game, we have a challenge that there's a lot of dark corners, dark edges. And when you're lightning dark places in video games, it actually comes with quite a challenge. Because when you're at night in real life, if you go to the forest at night, you don't see anything at all, completely pitch black. And maybe you're making a horror game, in which case maybe that's the one case where like you're making Slenderman or something and you will actually want the player to see nothing. But if you've played any video game that's at night, sure, if you look at this scene, it looks night. It definitely looks dark. I could go tell the player this is night. It's got the gritty dark, it's got some lights, some neons. But if you look at the actual lighting of the scene, it's incredibly bright. And that's the key when you're doing lighting for a scene that's supposed to be dark. It has to feel dark, but you still have to be able to see the game. Because if the player cannot see the game, he cannot play the game. He has to be able to see his character, to see his environment. And that's one of the biggest challenges that you have when you're going to be doing light during a night time. And once again, to really drive the point home of the modular assets, if you look at this scene, once again, you don't see any repetition, everything is dark, everything is nice, moody, Blade Runner kind alley. But if you break it down, if you look at the actual details, once again, less than 20 assets. Because if you truly plan your modules, here, 3 modules, the door, the window, and the little balcony. That, combined with vertex painting and a few of little extras, that was all I needed to create the scene. So modular thinking will save you hours of work, and it will allow you to create big, unique scenes. And if after you use them with what we discussed doing today of vertex painting, set dressing, small assets around the scene, no one will be able to tell. The main things, if you're going to remember anything from this presentation that I would really like for you to take away, is the first one, to combine modular systems. What I mean by this is, in all of the examples I showed you, there was 2 common factors, architecture and, for example, tubes, cables. If you're making any game that's happening at any point beyond 1960, cubes and you're making a scene, cables and tubes are going to be your best friend. They're great for set dressing, they give a lot of personality to the scene, and you can create a very simple modular system that works with your scene to, once again, break repetition. The second, set dressing is key. Those smaller assets that don't look as cool, it's not a crashed helicopter, it's not something badass that you're going to put in your portfolio. But those small assets, like planks, barrel, the stuff that is not impressive by itself, will be vital for the scene to feel alive. Because if I just have an empty room with 3 cool things in the room, it feels weird. However, if these 3 superbly cool things are surrounded by small assets of not much importance, but that tell a story together, that's going to make everything much more cohesive. And it's going to make the player feel much more immersed in the game. And the third one, texturing, of course, key, but I really can't stress it enough. Lightning will make or break your scene. Do make sure you're allocating enough time in production for lighting the scenes. It is an extremely important part of the process that can very easily get overlooked, especially if you're working with some time constraints. And that is it. Thank you very much. And if any of you have any questions, feel free to ask.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Anybody has any questions?
Hi, thank you for the presentation. So my question is, as I understand, I'm here.
Sorry.
Yeah, so as I understand, you're combining all assets inside the engine, am I right?
Yes.
And not inside the 3D tools or tool sets.
Correct. We combine the assets inside the engine itself.
So does it create any performance issues? Because actually you can bake the whole location inside the 3D engine, not inside the game engine. So how do you work with that?
So, for example, sometimes when we're creating, let's say, a building, what we would actually do is we would create the modules, but inside the, for example, Blender, 3ds Max, whatever you're using, we combine them inside and export it as a single object. So that does happen. However, the main restrictions here depends on how you're going to work. In our current game, we're working with a lot of prefabs that we need to be changing all the time. So we actually do need to have access to the modules separately. So we are building everything inside the engine. However, what you're describing of building it outside and then importing it is also something we've done. And that can be quite good because if you join the modules and then, for example, merge the vertices, it will save you quite a bit of memory. So it's very dependent on the situation of the specific project you're working in.
So it's always trade-off between, depends on the goal that you
Exactly.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Carlos. Bring a round of applause for Carlos Casals.